Hello, and welcome to Same Crime, Different Time. I'm Jennifer Chambers. You know that I'm passionate about uncovering the truth. Here, we're taking that passion to the dark heart of the Pacific Northwest. As a true crime and historical writer, I've spent years immersed in the chilling archives of this region. Each week, we'll explore cases, both ancient and modern, of murder, unexplained events, strange places, and those who have simply vanished. We'll dig into the research, connecting the dots between past and present, revealing the threads of mystery that weave through our incredible, yet often unsettling, landscape. Prepare to be captivated as we discover that while times may change, the darkest aspects of human nature remain hauntingly the same. It was a quiet town. Small, rural, just a couple thousand people in the heart of Oregon. Everyone knew someone. Summers felt long. Teenagers walked home from school or wandered the edges of town on their 16th birthdays. On October 15th, 1973, her 16th birthday, Deborah Lee Tomlinson left home with a teenage friend and was never seen again. No footprints, no confirmed sightings, no arrests, and no remains. In a place so small, one missing girl should have been unmissable. But in the shadows of 1970s Oregon and the record-keeping of that time, not every disappearance got the attention it deserved. Today we'll go back to Creswell, to the unanswered questions of a child who vanished into thin air, and we'll explore what it means when someone disappears at an age of transition and uncertainty. But before we return to Creswell, Oregon, and back to Deborah Lee Tomlinson, I want to pause for just a moment and talk about time. Because in recent years, something quietly remarkable has been happening in a lot of missing persons cases, and even missing persons cases across Oregon. Cases that sat cold for decades, their files were yellowed, the evidence was boxed away, and the names were slowly slipping from public memory. Those cases have begun to speak again. In early 2024, Oregon investigators announced that they had finally identified another young woman. This one had been missing since the late 1960s. For more than 50 years, she was known only as unidentified remains. No name, no story, and no one to claim her. But until new forensic tools, genetic genealogy, those kinds of advances in DNA analysis and relatives who uploaded family profiles, those connected her back to the life that she had lost. It didn't undo what happened, it didn't bring her back, but it did something else profoundly important. And something that happens so rarely. But it gave her back her name. That matters, especially in cases like Deborah's. In this case, the remains were, and this is a quote from WJCT News, so I want to make sure I get it right. In early 2024, Oregon State Police and local law enforcement used advanced DNA and genetic genealogy to finally identify the remains of previously identified woman as Sandra Young, a teenager from Portland who went missing in 1968 to 69. The skeletal remains had been discovered decades earlier near Sauvie Island, but remained unidentified until genetic genealogy tools connected her to living relatives, unquote. And Deborah disappeared in 1974, a time when missing teenagers were often labeled runaways and quietly deprioritized. The records were thin, and evidence collection was inconsistent. And once momentum stalled, I've talked about this before, many cases simply just stopped. But what these newly solved cold cases, like Sandra Young's, remind us is that time doesn't erase the truth, it only hides it. And evidence that once seemed useless can become meaningful, and it could be decades later. A memory somebody didn't think mattered can suddenly make everything more important and solve things. And advances in science with persistence can reopen these doors that were sealed shut. It doesn't mean every case will be solved, of course, or that hope should be forced, but Unsolved isn't forgotten. And as we move back into Deborah Lee Tomlinson's story, we're going to talk about her life and her disappearance and the questions that still remain. It's important to hold both realities, right? We don't know, but sometimes answers come when you don't expect them. This is Same Crime, Different Time, and this is the disappearance of Deborah Lee Tomlinson. I'm Jen Chambers. Part 1. Who was Deborah Lee Tomlinson? She was known to family and friends as Debbie. She was born on October 15th, 1957. There's not much known about her, actually, on the day she disappeared. She celebrated what should have been a joyful milestone, her 16th birthday. But instead it was the day that her life changed forever. She was described as a white female, about 5 feet, 5 inches tall, about 140 pounds. She had brown eyes and brown hair, and she had some distinctive moles around her neck. Now, like I said, Creswell, now, and especially in 1973, it was an intimate place. It has one high school, very quiet streets, familiar faces, everybody knows everybody, and a community where a missing teenager shouldn't be forgotten. But the public records on Deborah is surprisingly sparse. I assume that she grew up in that small town and went to Creswell High School, but I really haven't been able to find too much about her. Part 2, the day that she vanished. There are a few details known. On October 15th, 1973, Deborah supposedly left her aunt's house. And most sources describe this as running away with a female friend. And the female friend's identity has never been documented. The Charlie Project, which is one of the most comprehensive missing person archives, it really does a wonderful job. If you can donate to them. They note that Deborah simply ran away with a teenage friend and has never been heard from again. There's no confirmed sightings. No news coverage at the time has survived, or at least is easily accessible that I could find. There isn't a missing person report from that period that appears in searchable archives, and this has left huge gaps in the official narrative. It's worth saying straight up, her circumstances of her disappearance, whether they were planned or impulsive or influenced by somebody else, are mostly unknown. Part 3, what happened next? And here's where this case becomes maddeningly difficult. The only firm details in public databases are she was last seen in Creswell October 15th, 1973. She was 16 years old. She left with another teenage female whose identity is not documented, and nothing more has been publicly confirmed since that day. There were a bunch of investigators, including the Lane County Sheriff's Office, and they officially classify her disappearance as endangered missing and continue to treat it as an open case. And I'm sure they're doing the best that they can. Her family has said very little publicly, and there really was hardly any contemporary newspaper reporting, which may suggest, and I can't say that they thought this, but it could suggest that law enforcement might have believed early on that she really did run away, rather than fell victim to foul play. But if that's all there was to it, why has she never returned to contact her family? Why hasn't she surfaced in any known records? These are the kinds of questions that keep the missing person advocates, like people with the Charlie Project, coming back to her file. Part 4, the context of 1970s Oregon. I often like to talk about the context in all the cases that I present. I think that it just really gives you such a full picture of maybe not the whys, but at least the whens and the things surrounding it. The 1970s were a turbulent time for the nation and for Oregon, of course. Disappearances of young people were not uncommon, but they often went underinvestigated, especially in smaller towns like this, because they just didn't have the manpower. Creswell was isolated. Nearby Eugene was larger. I want to say it's about 30 miles Maybe that's too long, but it's fairly close. It's a couple towns adjacent to Eugene. It's far enough that local law enforcement's resources and media attention were limited. And all across Oregon in late 1973, several young women vanished or were found dead under suspicious circumstances, including other teenagers and other adults in nearby communities. And that kind of backdrop can kind of skew these memories of individual cases and get them all confused. But unlike these more higher profile cases that happened in larger cities, Deborah's disappearance didn't really get sustained attention at the time. And that shapes how the case is remembered today, with very little to go on. It's so sad. Part 5, Families. I can only imagine, for families of these missing loved ones, silence is its own kind of trauma. A missing person classification doesn't bring closure, it brings waiting for answers, for sightings, for any sign that life still persists. Some anecdotal accounts, including some recent family source posts online, suggest that relatives remain hopeful that Deborah was still alive somewhere, perhaps in California, and that the early assumptions of her being a runaway might have sidelined the investigation to go any deeper. But it doesn't matter whether she made a choice or she was compelled into a situation that she regretted. The lack of follow-up documentation has this huge vacuum that's filled with speculation and unanswered questions, and I'm sure for the family personal grief. I think about that a lot when I'm talking about these cases, whether they're missing person cases or tales of crime. I try to be sensitive because I'm sure it's horrific for these family members. But I often, and along with, I'm not the only journalist who thinks this, is it better to talk about it or to not talk about it? And the conclusion I come to is if I had a family member who was missing, I would want the extra attention if possible. Part 6, how do cases like this go cold? This is, of course, not unique to Creswell. Cases from the 60s and 70s and earlier, but they often suffer decades of silence because the missing person reporting systems were fragmented. NCIC and Name Us, which are organizations that are nationwide now, databases, they weren't accessible to the public. And the interagency communication between departments in different areas was poor. It was necessarily how it was. And newspapers didn't digitize old issues, so that wasn't available. And families don't always know how to file reports in the correct amount of time, or maybe they thought that local law enforcement has. So not specifically Deborah's case, but I also often talk about this show about cold cases that benefit from DNA or forensic advances. Her case is not one of those yet, because there's so little physical evidence that's documented, at least publicly. If there were things like fingerprints or dentals or reliable DNA files, national databases could more readily link her to the unidentified remains that might be found elsewhere. And maybe that's happening. Right now, we've just got a file number that's still not been closed. Deborah would be 68 years old today. We don't know where she is. We don't know what she experienced after she left Creswell. We don't even know the name of the friend she left with. Her disappearance is still an open case, and it stands as a reminder of how many young lives vanish from small towns without answers and closure and without the public attention that they deserve. If you have any information or memories about Deborah Lee Tomlinson, you can contact the Lane County Sheriff's Office. You can look that up online. This case remains listed as endangered with open investigative status. I'm Jen Chambers. This is Same Crime, Different Time. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and don't let small-town mysteries slip into silence. Some resources you could look at that have to do with this episode. You can look at the file about Deborah Lee Tomlinson on the Charlie Project. You can look at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is missingkids.org. It's got basic case data and age progression. There's the Doe network. Her file is on there under Deborah Lee Tomlinson. There is a information about her on a blog called Another Bundy Blog, Deborah Lee Tomlinson, and on Creswell. There are a lot of really interesting anecdotes about Deborah Lee Tomlinson's life, some conversations that the author had with her family members on there. I don't want to quote them in my work because it's not mine, but also there are some really interesting theories that Deborah might have been killed by one of several different serial killers who were in the Pacific Northwest in the early to the late 60s through the middle 70s, including Ted Bundy, who was going through the area, different times of Oregon, during his murder career. Also, Warren Leslie Forrest, who's a murderer that's been responsible for 2 convicted murders and possibly 5 additional ones as far back as 1971. There's also there's several different murderers that it could be. There's information on the blog saying that she could have been killed by a man named Marquette. But I urge you to go to Another Bundy Blog to look at all of the research there and all of the different information ideas that it could be. They do share that they believe that the DNA might be able to be analyzed soon. So I don't know. The author of Another Bundy Blog posted some information about Deborah Lee Tomlinson on April 3rd, 2024. So again, I urge you to look at that there. But it's just such a sad case. It's caught, right between the times that we were able to solve things a little bit more easily. And there's so many cases like this. But I'm glad that we can remember her, and I appreciate you listening. Thanks a lot. We'll come back next week with another story of crime from the Pacific Northwest.
Thanks for listening today. Please review and rate wherever you listen to podcasts. That really helps out the show. And please leave us a voicemail at the Spotify link. Also, you can always feel free to send us an email at scdtmail@gmail.com or www.jennifer-chambers.com.